Hey guys, and welcome to Betwixt the Books, where we're doing a pretty regular review. I mean, it is still in our joint style here instead of our normal style, in part because I'm using the base of my tripod to hold up my Christmas tree, and it is Christmas time. So I was, and also because it's nice to see Gretchen's face and you can watch us react to things the other person says. I like this. I don't know. If you hate it, we can go back to the old way, but I like it. But we're gonna do a nonfiction review, which is unheard of for us.
Well, unheard of for you and unheard of for us.
Us together.
Extremely common for me.
I mean, well, we did do one other nonfiction review this year with the therapy memoir, but
Oh, that's right. I had already blocked that out of my brain.
But if you're wondering, I'm sure it's in the title somewhere. We're going to be talking about Unworthy Republic, which is a history book, which is definitely very much within Gretchen's wheelhouse. If you didn't know, we were reading this for the challenge that we keep not meeting, but have now succeeded in, of reading an anti-racist nonfiction book. This one in particular is focusing on Indigenous peoples, and specifically the forced dispossession and migration of Indigenous peoples from the eastern seaboard to the plains of the United States. That's this guy. Do you want to do a better does that encompass it? Do you want to do a better description of what this book entails? Do you have a better description? That's what it is.
No, I don't think so.
That's it on the tin.
It is what it is.
It is.
It is certainly not happy reading.
No.
As you can tell by the blood streaks on the cover.
Yeah.
That's what that is meant to represent. But it is definitely worthwhile and important reading.
I just finished this today, and I don't think I've thought of it's really hard for me to rate nonfiction because it's not like an experience. I can't rate it 5 stars. I enjoyed it in the same way that you can with a fiction book, right? My brain is saying 3 stars. It was fine. It gave information. I didn't get super bored. I did get a little bit lost sometimes, but it may have been because I was listening to it on audio, which for this particular book, and we'll talk about it, might not be the best way to ingest this information. But that might be a me problem. It's okay. It was all right. It's not a bad book. If somebody asked me whether or not they should buy it, I would probably say, yeah, go ahead, go for it. It's a good one. Especially because it's information that I feel doesn't get talked about a lot. I mentioned when we were thinking of books for this challenge, one of the reasons I wanted to do this one was because I feel America in general, when we talk about Native Americans, sort of just talk about them in the past tense of there used to be Indigenous people here and now there aren't, and they're all gone, and don't worry about it. And I was like, maybe we should do one about Indigenous people because obviously they still exist, they're still suffering. This doesn't necessarily fulfill that goal, and we'll probably talk about that later as well, but that was my logic behind it. So yeah, 3 stars. It was okay. It was all right. It was a book. It did book. It did book.
It did book. I believe I rated it 4 stars on Goodreads, and I don't remember what my story graph was, but since on story graph you can do decimal points,
Yeah.
it's sometimes a little bit different. For me, obviously I read a lot of nonfiction, and I don't want to go too much into this, but basically I gave it 4 stars predominantly because I was impressed on how much information Claudio Saunt, I believe is how you say his name, was able to convey in a concise and clear way. And that is certainly not always the case in nonfiction, trying to cover this much time and these many events with these many different tribes and peoples and governments and territories and states. And so there's definitely I feel like that was a very technically written book, and we will go more into that. But it is a more traditional nonfiction style. So if you were looking for something that's very narrative, that's not here. But I did give it 4 stars.
trust her opinion more than mine, I feel like, because again, not I read like 1 or 2 nonfiction books a year, whereas Gretchen reads like quite a lot. How many are you at this year so far?
I don't want to know. I've read almost 150 books this year. And like at least a solid third of that will be nonfiction, if not more. I think it's more. But yeah.
Her opinion on this is more helpful to you, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean,
I
tend to rate nonfiction on like writing style,
yeah,
and how well it's able to communicate the information. Because, while I do know about this history, right? It's not like I know about the details of it or the technical details, and so I rate it as, am I able to understand it? And then am I able to follow it? And I would agree, I would not read this on audio. Like if I had to do it over again, I would definitely read the print book. And I do all of my nonfiction on audio. So that's a pretty strong thing for me. It is hard to follow on audio. But I think as a conveyor of information, again, it's not like narratively like a fiction book. But it definitely is clear in the concepts it's trying to explain to you over a long length of time.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that when we were talking about how we were going to review this was that Gretchen was saying was like one of the things she enjoys with nonfiction books is whether or not it gives her new information. And this comes up when she's like, for instance, has read 7 Nixon books and she's read the 7th one and she's like, nothing new came out of this. It is just another Nixon book. This book definitely is covering a topic that I feel like a lot of people have not heard of. I asked my partner, he listened to part of it while I was just listening to it live, and he was like, I didn't know about this at all. So in theory, either his history classes in school didn't touch on it, or it was like so insignificantly mentioned that he forgot about it, which matters. Gretchen and I both talked about how we had in theory only really heard about the Trail of Tears, which is just one particular tribe's experience of this, the Cherokee Nation, and doesn't really touch on all of the other tribes that were also subject to the same policies and things and their experiences. And again, for the most part, that was like pretty minorly covered in class. It was just like, oh, this was a thing that happened. It was kind of bad. Don't worry about it. This is like going to go in depth into all of the policies, how they were twisted, misled, full on lied to, just ignored, impersonated, like every single thing that you can think of that could be used to essentially cheat the Indigenous people out of their land and force them to move, all the way up to and including outright killing them for no reason other than being there. Like that's all going to be included in here, and you're going to get it more or less chronologically. So you're going to hop around and hear like, here's the Cherokees at the beginning of this, and here's the Cherokees in the middle of this, and here's the Cherokees at the end, and here's what's happening with the Seminoles. So you're getting all of these different tribes who were all subject to this and all of their different reactions, whether it was to initially try and stay, whether it was to try to assimilate, whether it was to even from the outright go, okay, sure, we'll go, give us money for our land and we'll go and make sure that we get there safely, which also did not happen or was not done to the extent that it should have been done. All of this stuff is going to be given to you, and I feel like understanding this is important, especially for most Americans, because we're all sitting on stolen land, every single one of us. We did mention how it does not really talk about the Northeast and how they did that because the time frame that this covers, most of the Northeast had already moved all of their Indigenous folks. So it's really focusing from kind of like Pennsylvania, Ohio, south, like the Indigenous cultures that lived there. So if you're a New Englander like we are, or a New Yorker, you're probably not going to hear about the Indigenous folks who were in your area very much. Maybe mentions here and there, but not a lot. It definitely focuses way more on like the southern eastern seaboard areas, but definitely helpful information and a part of American history that is quite shameful and I feel like more people should hear about.
So again, one of the things that I really focus on when I read a nonfiction book is the writing style. And I feel like the writing style here, I mentioned it briefly, but it really is like a double-edged sword in terms of this book. I also feel like I did a slight disservice by almost directly before I had read this book, I read a new joint biography on William Henry Harrison and Tecumseh called Gallop the Sun. I can't quite remember it. I'm not going to look it up. Which was really well done, and was far more narrative history than this is. Again, this is a traditional nonfiction text, which is like, and in 17, this happened, blah, blah. So again, I'm still impressed with the size of this book versus the amount of material that it covers. I feel like for someone who doesn't want to go and read like a 400, 500 page book, which sometimes is what I prefer because I'm like, I want all of the details, skip nothing. So I mean, the size of this for the material you get is it's just really well done for like a general reader who's not me, to get all this information in a very clear way. Again, I'm not a legal scholar. I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I don't know any of this, and I feel like I don't know land rights. Being able to explain not only like what they were, but also how the United States government like twisted them and got around them. Because again, it's one thing to explain what the land rights were, and then it's another thing to explain how they were manipulated and to have you understand that the whole way through, as a reader with no legal knowledge. Like, that's really well done. Michaela and I have a slightly different interpretation on this, I think, but I also think that it was a really good idea to take it chronologically. And it's, again, double-edged sword. It doesn't make it a good audiobook because you can get really confused, but at the same time, you're really just getting wave after wave of like, they did it to this tribe, and then they did it to this tribe, and then this happened in a certain way, and they were like, oh, we can manipulate this way, or we'll change this treaty that way. And the number of treaties they made and broke and made and broke, and it just really can feel quite overwhelming. Yep. In like the way that it's supposed to. Yes. Like, how can this just keep happening? But at the same time, the writing is quite clinical. And so when you get to, like, for example, the forced removal marches, and he's like giving you numbers like 50 Cherokee started here and 23 of them died. And in some places he will describe like the cholera epidemic, for example, but it does feel a little bit clinical. And again, I had just read this other book on Native American wars and battles with the government that was way more personalized, I think, which probably made me come down harsher on that. But it did read very clinical.
Nameless, faceless Indigenous people who are just falling over constantly. And you don't they're people, and the sheer amount of them who are dying is sad, but you have no connection to them at all throughout the book. Like, there's very few like who specifically get called out and named, and their experiences are shown.
Yeah. Well, and of course, part of that is like, right, what first person sources does Santo have to take from? There's not a lot of Native voices from this time, especially because they were all dying and being forcibly like forced to leave all of their belongings behind and move to somewhere where they did not have the resources or the knowledge base of like the plants and the animals that they had. So like, no one's sitting there going Dear Diary necessarily. But I will say, to the other side of that, that Santo is really good at bringing in first person voices to kind of show you a case study of a voice of a certain time, and bringing in lots of different voices and different named people. I think the problem is that, and again, in the book that I had just read, is a dual biography of William Henry Harrison and Tecumseh. So you're able to follow two people through the entire story, which helps you to connect with them. Or want to set William Henry Harrison on fire strongly. But in this one, because it's like, this event is happening, and here's like an explanation of what was happening from a first person source. always, 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 you should be using first-person sources, 100%. Primary sources, social studies teacher in me, primary sources, baby. But at the same time, like just using one person as a case study and then moving on, it's not quite the same. So again, there's like this double-edged sword of like, I really liked the writing, but at the same time, it had its drawbacks. And I think it's just about like who you are as a reader. And so if you know that you need a stronger narrative to get you through a book, even one like this that isn't like quite that long or as long as some other nonfiction books, that's just not going to happen here. But at the same time, it's like, if this is history you really want to learn, it's a really concise and clear way to understand it.
The last sort of thing that we wanted to talk about on this was to my point of where I kind of, when I'm reading something like this, and I know it is just a history text that is talking about this one time period in history and this one, well, many events, but like the one thing, which is just the removal and slaughter in some cases of the Indigenous people. Part of me really wanted, even if it was just in the 70 plus pages of back matter that this book has listing all of the sources, a page that said, here is what is happening today to the Indigenous people who this is still actively affecting. The biggest movement is land back that would be represented by the troubles in this text, right? So like having something say like, hey, were you rightfully upset by how all of this land was stolen from the Indigenous? Here's what they're doing now to try and rectify it, how you can help, how you can do something. In the same way that I feel like it's kind of weird as he is a self-proclaimed white person and we are white people looking at a text that very much is focused on a particular group of people of color who were and still are constantly underserved. It feels like you should at least mention, to fight this narrative that they no longer exist anymore, they're just figures in history that had stuff happen to them. Here's what's happening today. So I am going to have linked down in the bottom land back. So if you would like to go and look and see what some of the things that they're trying to do to get some of their sacred places back, that's an option for you. I'm going to link in the bottom MMIW so that you can go and look and see some of the violence that is still being enacted on Indigenous people and going underserved injustice. And I'm going to link, I think Orange Shirt Day, I'm going to link under there, which is technically a Canadian group, but North America didn't have United States and Canada when the Indigenous people were in charge of it. So it's like still definitely part of the same culture. And that was a group specifically talking about helping survivors of the schools that were the Indigenous children were forced to go to basically get rid of their cultural heritage. So I'm going to link those below because I think it's important to say these are things that are happening today to help fight all of the problems that came up in this book. I wanted this book to be more useful. One of the things I mentioned to Gretchen was talking about how I was like, how could this be handed to somebody in like a history class? And it really can't, you can't like take out a chapter and have somebody read it. You have to read it in its entirety. It would make no sense to read a chapter on its own. So we both agree that like this would be like if you took a history class in college or an Indigenous studies class in college, you would be reading the whole text. It would be assigned to you as one of your things and you would read the whole thing. There's really no way to pick out a piece of it and use that. And it is our history and it is important to learn about. So it's something that I want more people to read. And it's not like it is inaccessible. Like I think an average American could read this and understand it. It is definitely a drier text. Like it's not going to have the same mass appeal that a narrative nonfiction book is going to. But I do still feel like it's at least accessible for most Americans to like read and understand, to comprehend what was going on. And I think it does succeed in like making you upset. It definitely gives you the emotional response that I wanted from a book like this, but I feel like it is not as useful of a text as I would like from this. Now, not the book's fault. Again, it was very successful in a lot of things that it did, but there were some things that I wish it did that it did not. And I feel like there is a disservice done in that case, because it's not really useful outside of reading the entire book on its own. And it doesn't really give you anything that you can do to help now. It's continuing this narrative of a thing that happened in the past. Oh, well, move on with your life. America sucks sometimes. Continue. But yes, so not a bad book. It booked. It succeeded.
It booked.
it did book. But it could have. We always want just a little bit more.
Well,
Very
and
picky.
I will say too, just like as a close up, because oh, boy, I can't. What this book does in the end is it's like, hey, remember all of the like 50 like focal characters we've used throughout this book? Here's what happened to them after the events of this book and like through the rest of their life.
Yeah.
And I just, as a general rule, despise when nonfiction books do that, because I feel like if you have, like, especially with this book, just like, you, even if it doesn't do what we want, it does at the end, like, bring the hammer down.
Yeah.
And then you're like, and now we're going to do all of this. And you're like,
you lost the potency of that
why?
emotional. Yeah.
Yeah. And especially in a book like this, where there were so many people and it was hard. Like, he was like, and then this person, this is what happened in the rest of their life. And I'm like, who?
When was this person talking
When?
about again?
So again, I what I will say is, like, first of all, Claudio Saunt is not native. And I mean, this is just like a train of books that we are well, I am looking at right now. And the other one that I read was unintentional, but I will say is Gallop Toward the Sun, Tecumseh and Harrison's Struggle for the Destiny of a Nation by Peter Stark. Also not native, but I read it because I needed a book on William Henry Harrison, which is not easy to find because he has the shortest presidency of all time. And this is more about his treatment of Native Americans. And turns out that a president that I thought was just a funny trivia answer is like a terrible, horrible person, and is also a very specific episode of Native American like relations and history that we should know more about. And it does the thing at the end where it brings it all the way up to like this statue of Tecumseh that is like and like how like this memory has translated all the way to present day. And so while Peter Stark is also not native, and I didn't necessarily read that book for that reason, it is more narrative. So that might be more interesting. I had an actual meltdown about Henry Harry. Like I was like texting like these friends I have in a history chat like this, and I was like, I did not know I needed to set this man on fire. Because I had heard of Tecumseh and the Cherokee Confederacy, but I had never understood this part of the history. So new history, all that kind of stuff. So it might be another book, and obviously we'll continue reading on this and get a native voice in here as well. We picked this one also because it was a National Book Award finalist.
Yes. Yeah. And I think we were originally intending to read it for Indigenous Peoples Day, but our lives got in the way of that. So it was also supposed to be timely in that matter, but it didn't really work out that way.
And then we were like, it's cool. We can do it for Thanksgiving. And then that didn't.
That also got pushed back.
We were committed to doing it by the end of the year, and we did it.
Nailed it.
So things to look forward to. We will be filming another reading roundtable episode. There will be 3 of us, Michaela and I and our lovely friend Anne. And we will be doing one that has had a certain amount of hype to it, which is reading adult books by formerly YA authors. And I am really fascinated to have this discussion. Anne now reads more YA than Michaela and I do. We used to read a lot of it, though.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the authors that we grew up with in particular are now writing adult books. That'll be really interesting to talk about. And this is a book that, like a book from a category of our buddy reading challenge. And as it is coming to the end of 2023, we will have to have a reckoning of the things that we did and the things that we didn't do, and come up with new challenges or rollover challenges for 2024, because we always like complete, I feel like 75% of the challenges, and then the other ones were just like, shh,
we'll do it next year. Don't worry about it.
Don't worry about it. So you can look forward to a video at some point of us saying, we kind of did it. And here's
Listen.
what we'll try to do this year.
Listen, we did. I will take 75% is like pretty good. Like I will take that. Honestly, like 1 year, is it next year? We'll smash it out the park and do all of them. But like it still guides our rating. It's still fun. So definitely look forward to hearing about
when
that.
we'll do the whole thing in 1 year when I don't have schoolwork and you don't have a shit job going, it's like time at your job.
That's never gonna happen.
It's great. It's gonna happen. These are our wishes for 2020.
Fingers crossed.
All right. We'll see you for all of those plans moving forward. Thanks, guys. Bye.